All right, folks. So this very brief PowerPoint is meant to help explain to you the evolution of our party systems and how we get to the progressive era. And I'm even going to finish on, what it means to be a modern day capital D Democrat. All right. All right. So let's begin. All right. So just like me, I can't just start at the turn of the century. I have to go back to the very beginning. All right. So think back to the beginning of the year, the very first party system in our country, 1790s to 1815. All right, if you remember, the Constitution was ratified. There technically were no political parties, but quickly they developed. And one party was led by Thomas Jefferson, and one party was led by Alexander Hamilton. All right, Hamilton's party were known as the Federalists, and they largely were the Federalists that existed prior to the Constitution, those that were in favor of its ratification. And Jefferson led the Democrat-Republicans. All right, they were largely the anti-Federalists before the Constitution was ratified, with one notable defection. Alex Hamilton changed sides, didn't like how powerful the national government had become. All right, so the first party system was the Federalist versus the Democrat-Republicans. All right, now if you remember, in 1815, the Federalist Party came out against the War of 1812, and they wanted to limit the power of the national government, make it more difficult to declare war and stuff like that. So they looked un-American, anti-American, what have you. The War of 1812 was quite popular among Americans, so they kind of fell apart as a party. So from 1815 to 1824 was the, quote, era of good feelings. There was only one political party in charge, so a lot of stuff got done. All right, but if you remember in 1828, Andrew Jackson runs for president against John Quincy Adams. If you remember, Andrew Jackson got more popular votes. Remember, 1824 was the first election where Americans voted for an actual candidate in some states, not just electors. So there was a popular vote tally, and Jackson got more, but neither got enough to win the election outright in the Electoral College. And the House chooses John Quincy Adams, and Jackson gets very angry, thinking that he was gypped of the presidency, and the party more or less split in half from 1824 to 1828. And those who kind of picked John Quincy Adams became the National Republicans and eventually became known as the Whigs. And those who supported Andrew Jackson became the Democrats. And that is the modern day Democratic Party that was founded more or less by Andrew Jackson. Now, if you remember, the Whig Party collapsed in the 1850s, early 50s, after the Kansas-Nebraska Act split them in half. Half of the Whigs supported slavery. They were the Cotton Whigs down south. The other half, more or less, up north, didn't support slavery. They were the Conscience Whigs. All right, it split the party in half. And they then formed the Republican Party, if you remember, in 1854, that was built around the platform issue of not allowing slavery to expand. All right, and a lot of your Southern Whigs became Democrats. So the third party system was your pro-slavery Democrats versus your anti-slavery expansion of slavery Republicans. Okay, and those are the two modern day political parties that we have today. Okay, now remember, up until this point, both political parties have been completely laissez-faire. Government hands off the economy. Okay. And from 1896 to 1932, it was more or less a continuation of that. All right. That's, though, when you began to hear certain groups clamoring for more government involvement in the economy. Remember, I talked about the working class saying that first, and the populace. And then the third group, which is the point of this, is the progressives. They begin to advocate for more government control over the economy. Although you begin to see a little bit of it in the 1890s with the Sherman Act, the Clayton Antitrust Act, and government does start to legislate some moral or social issues, but not economic. Okay, this is, by the way, when prostitution and or certain types of drug use begin to become illegal. Those were social issues or moral issues, not economic. So the only ways in which the government became more hands-on in this era, 96 to 32, was the Clayton Antitrust Act and the Sherman Antitrust Act. All right, so now let's move on to the next slide. And this kind of gives you an idea of how we get to the progressives and even how we get to the modern day Democrats. So if you look on the left-hand column here, all right, from the 1790s through the 1880s is the left-hand column here. So the ratification, if you look at the first bullet, the ratification of the Constitution in June of 1788 signaled the slow emergence of classical liberal thought, laissez-faire, free market, capitalist economy, Hamilton's vision. So if you look at the second bullet, this means that by and large, most Americans, government and non-governmental, your common average citizen, believed in a laissez-faire type of government, smaller, hands-off. Government should not interfere in the business world and in people's personal lives. All right. Now let's fast forward to the 1880s through World War I through 1917-ish. So following the Civil War, 1870s and after, it's key to remember that big business rose, and that changed everything. Remember, prior to the Civil War, the closest things we had were the Lowell textile mills and railroads, and they were both of them were nothing compared to the big businesses you saw emerge after the Civil War. The railroads basically exploded in size. So in the 1870s and after, big business rose, and that led to wealthy, powerful corporations. It also led to low-paid, often immigrant factory workers that lived in crowded tenements in cities, and farmers who were exploited by railroads and bankers. Railroads would charge farmers a ton of money to transport their crops. They price gouge them. Okay. So in the 1880s, this was the second group to begin to clamor for more government involvement after the working class. Farmers who began to advocate for greater involvement in business. They began to try and advocate for regulating certain businesses like railroads, government control over certain industries like railroads. That was their big enemy here. But remember, populists were dismissed as loony, uneducated folk, quote, non-elite. Think back to the video quiz and that hot air balloon slide that you saw. All right, so to speak. So in the 1890s is when you get to the social gospel movement, which morphs into more or less the progressive movement. All right, much like abolitionism came out of the Second Great Awakening, a religious revival. All right, in the 1890s, the first reformers were religiously motivated, and they were called the social gospel. But when it became more secular and scientific in nature, it became known as the progressive movement. So progressives at the turn of the century, the turn of the 20th century, reacting to what they argued were the tremendous negatives produced by capitalism, dominated by big business. They began to argue that government should regulate the business world to soften capitalism, right? So they saw these unregulated capitalists exploiting the working class, creating this so-called dangerous, growing in size, full of disease and poverty, alcoholism, prostitution, things like that. Capitalism was causing this class of people to grow, all right, all the while they were taking away the democracy, so to speak, of the working class, exploiting them, controlling their lives, and getting really, really rich and powerful in the process. All right, too much so. It was hurting our democracy, progressives thought. All right, so they wanted the government to step in and protect people from what they viewed as the now inevitable negatives of capitalism. They argued the older hands-off laissez-faire model no longer worked because businesses had become so big and powerful. And they argued, yeah, it may have worked before the Civil War, but that, it's a new reality. This reality was not there prior to the Civil War. Big business changes all that, they argued. Okay, so again, that's what progressives were. They saw themselves as this intellectual, scientific, rational go-between the greedy, wealthy that were too greedy, and the working class that was uneducated, unsophisticated, not enough of a work ethic. They were demoralized. Okay. Now, if you look at the last bolt, let me get into modern day stuff here. This is going to be more US2 stuff, but hey, it doesn't hurt to learn it, right? And if you have me for US2 next year, you're going to see this again next year. So World War I, which was largely viewed as a progressive war, or at least our entrance into it, led to the end of the movement. All right. So there was kind of like a lull in progressivism from 1917-ish to the late 1920s. But remember, if you look at the right-handmost column in 29, the Great Depression hits. And that was laissez-faire, hands-off capitalism collapsing. That was the complete collapse of hands-off free market capitalism. All right. So in 1932, so the Depression begins in 29. It gets worse and worse, and by 32, 1/4 of Americans are unemployed. All right, we're the GDP, we're making about half of what we used to. It was a disaster, and it had spread globally. All right, we were not the only one to experience a depression. So in 1932, the Democratic Party, FDR was running for election against Herbert Hoover, who was president in 29 from 32. And FDR is the first major politician to basically say the government will step in and try and help. So in 1932, the progressives resurrect as FDR Democrats. And behind his New Deal argue that government needs a bigger role in the business world. So progressives, they were from both parties, Republican and Democrat, in the early 20th century. But in 32, they resurrect as modern day Democrats. So modern Democrats, if you look at the last bullet, modern liberals claim to be an adaptation to the changing business world. They claim that the more hands-on model of modern day liberalism is a correction of classical liberalism that they argue, like the progressives did, no longer works because of the rise of big business. All right.